Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of written record that we have.
Stuff together, specifically talking about these ancient tablets,
Mm-hmm.
which are, to me, some of the most interesting things about ancient history.
For over 4,000 years, a set of clay tablets buried in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia has been quietly sitting in museum collections. Today, we'll finally hear what they have to say. One of these ancient Sumerian tablets, written in cuneiform by scribes of city-states like Nippur and Uruk around the late 3rd millennium BCE, reveals a hidden world beneath us. But there's much more than this in the wealth of these clay tablets. Let's see what the ancients wanted us to know about their worldview, the world of the Sumerian tablets. In the dry heat of southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, 19th century explorers digging into ancient mounds known as tells began pulling up written language, pressed into wet clay and left to harden like time capsules from the world's earliest cities. Today, more than 500,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments have been recovered from Mesopotamia, with tens of thousands originating from major Sumerian centers such as Ur, Uruk, and Nippur. Ur, located near modern Nasiriyah, was one of the great urban hubs of the early 3rd millennium BCE, while Uruk, often considered one of the world's first true cities, flourished as early as 3,500 BCE and may have housed populations exceeding 40,000 people at its peak. Nippur, roughly 160 kilometers south of modern Baghdad, functioned less as a political capital and more as a sacred city devoted to the god Enlil, where scribes preserved religious and administrative knowledge for centuries. What makes these tablets extraordinary is not just their quantity, but their age. Many date back over 4,000 to 5,000 years, placing them among the earliest written records in human history. They are inscribed in cuneiform, a wedge-shaped script pressed into clay using a reed stylus. Developed around 3,200 BCE in Uruk, cuneiform began as pictographic accounting marks and gradually evolved into a full writing system. For the most part, the tablets record the mundane: grain inventories, livestock tallies, taxation records, temple offerings, labor assignments. But that was not always the case. Some texts step away from counting goods and instead attempt to explain existence itself. Mythological and religious tablets appear in the same archives as economic receipts, often written by the same scribal class. This overlap is crucial. In Sumer, there was no strict boundary between governance, religion, and literature. A temple was not just a place of worship, it was also an economic institution, controlling land, labor, and storage. The gods were not distant metaphysical abstractions, but active participants in the political and agricultural order. Within this worldview, creation myths describe a cosmos structured through divine action rather than scientific process. The separation of heaven and earth, the establishment of cities, and the granting of kingship are recurring themes. Texts such as early versions of the Eridu Genesis and later Akkadian adaptations show layered traditions of flood narratives and divine organization of the world. These accounts are not presented as symbolic philosophy in the modern sense. They are treated as authoritative histories. Geographically, these tablets anchor us in a world of city-states spread across southern Mesopotamia. Ur, for example, was a major port city during its peak in the 21st century BCE under the 3rd dynasty of Ur, while Nippur maintained religious authority even when political power shifted elsewhere. Uruk's archaeological layers reveal continuous habitation for over 4,000 years, making it one of the longest inhabited urban sites on Earth. Modern recovery of these tablets has been shaped by both discovery and conflict. Early excavations by British archaeologists such as Sir Leonard Woolley at Ur in the 1920s uncovered royal tombs and thousands of artifacts, many of which are now housed in the British Museum. In Iraq itself, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad holds one of the largest collections of Mesopotamian artifacts, though it suffered significant losses during periods of war and looting in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. What emerges from this vast archive is not a fragmented mystery, but a highly organized civilization. They documented everything: the movement of goods, the authority of kings, the actions of gods, the structure of the cosmos. This brings us to the hidden world beneath us, the Sumerian underworld, a hidden world beneath our feet. Deep beneath the cities of ancient Sumer, there existed a place that was not simply below in a physical sense, but below in the structure of existence itself. The Sumerians called it Kur. The word itself carries multiple meanings in the earliest cuneiform texts, often translated as mountain, foreign land, or the underworld. Kur is not described as an abstract idea. In surviving mythological tablets, it is consistently treated as an actual location with boundaries, access points, and inhabitants. The logic of the Sumerian cosmos is vertical: the heavens above, the human world in the middle, and Kur below. This structure appears across multiple independent texts, suggesting it was not an isolated poetic metaphor, but a shared cosmological framework embedded in religious thought across city-states such as Ur, Lagash, and Eridu. One of the most detailed narrative sources comes from the myth commonly known as the Descent of Inanna, preserved in cuneiform tablets dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE, with later Akkadian versions expanding its themes. In this text, Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and political power, decides to descend into Kur. The journey is not described as symbolic abstraction, but as a physical passage through 7 gates, each one requiring the removal of a piece of divine regalia. At each gate, a gatekeeper enforces rules of passage. Kur itself is ruled in later traditions by Ereshkigal, a goddess associated with death and the underworld. Her domain is described as a place of no return, where light does not exist and where the dead are judged or confined. In the narrative structure of Sumerian mythology, this is not a distant philosophical concept, but a functioning realm, with administration, hierarchy, and rules, mirroring the bureaucratic nature of Sumerian city life itself, where temples controlled labor, land, and food distribution through detailed record-keeping. The scribes who recorded these myths were the same administrative class responsible for documenting grain storage in Ur or temple offerings in Nippur. In cities like Nippur, which functioned as a religious center dedicated to the god Enlil, thousands of tablets recovered from temple archives show that mythological texts were stored alongside economic records. This means that Kur, for the Sumerians, was quite literally a land down below. It is often described in the texts as a sealed or inaccessible domain. One recurring phrase describes it as a place that cannot be opened once entered. Rivers appear in its descriptions, often referred to as boundary waters, separating it from the world of the living. In some versions, it is guarded by beings or deities who control passage. These structural elements, such as gates, rivers, and guardians, mirror the organization of cities like Uruk itself, where entry points, walls, and controlled access defined urban life. Uruk, by around 3000 BCE, had massive defensive walls stretching over 9 kilometers, one of the earliest known examples of large-scale urban fortification. What is crucial in interpreting Kur is understanding that Sumerian cosmology was not based on geological observation of Earth's interior. So, when the Sumerians said that Kur was below, what they meant was below in a layered universe rather than an internal planetary structure. You could not dig your way to it, just as men could not fly to the heavens back then. But they did treat it as a very real place. In the Descent of Inanna, the goddess eventually dies in Kur and remains there for 3 days and 3 nights before being revived through the intervention of other deities. This cycle of descent and return appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian literature and is often linked to agricultural symbolism, death and renewal tied to seasonal cycles along the Tigris and Euphrates floodplain. Another important feature of Kur is its permanence. Once entered, the dead are unable to return. The concept of no return reinforces its role as a final boundary in the cosmic order. Tablets describing funerary rituals from cities like Ur indicate offerings made to the dead, suggesting that communication with Kur was indirect and ritualized rather than physical. The structure of Sumerian belief also reflects their environment. Southern Mesopotamia is a flat, alluvial plain, with no mountains or natural underground cave systems comparable to those imagined in later folklore traditions. This geography likely influenced how below was conceptualized, not as a physical hollow earth, but as an unseen realm beneath the visible world. In fact, their idea of the cosmos was much different than our own, but it was thoroughly developed, understood as a fact of life, and recorded. This brings us to the beginning of it all, at least according to the Sumerians: creation traditions and cosmic order. In the cities of ancient southern Mesopotamia, Uruk, Nippur, and Eridu, creation was not recorded as a single origin story etched into a unified doctrine. Instead, it survives as scattered fragments across thousands of clay tablets, written over centuries between roughly 3200 BCE and 1800 BCE. Unlike later religious systems that present creation as a linear sequence, Sumerian texts reflect a decentralized tradition. Each major city-state had its own patron deity. In Eridu, one of the oldest known settlements in southern Mesopotamia, inhabited as early as 5400 BCE, creation narratives are closely tied to the god Enki, associated with wisdom and fresh water. In Nippur, religious authority centers on Enlil, a deity linked to authority and cosmic governance. The cosmos itself, as described in these texts, is structured vertically. Above lies the domain of the gods, often associated with heaven or An. In the middle is the human world, where cities like Ur and Lagash operate under divine mandate. Below lies Kur, the underworld, a sealed and inaccessible realm associated with death and the unknown. Divine beings play a central role in this structure. In later Mesopotamian tradition, a group known as the Anunnaki becomes associated with high-ranking gods who participate in decisions about fate, kingship, and cosmic order. The term appears in Akkadian and Babylonian sources more prominently than in the earliest Sumerian layers. These beings are not creators in the modern theological sense, but administrators of an already structured cosmos. Importantly, Sumerian creation narratives are not found in a single canonical text. Instead, they are embedded within hymns, temple inscriptions, liturgical songs, and mythological fragments. For example, temple hymns from cities like Ur and Nippur often describe the establishment of sacred order as part of divine praise rather than a standalone cosmology. A hymn might describe how a god established the foundations of the city or set the divine decrees, blending creation with political legitimacy. This integration of myth and governance reflects how Sumerian society functioned. Temples were not only religious centers, but economic institutions, controlling land, labor, and surplus production. In Ur, for instance, administrative tablets from around 2100 BCE during the third dynasty of Ur showed temple systems managing thousands of workers and vast agricultural output. Creation narratives, therefore, are often tied to ideas of order, control, and organization, both cosmic and civic. By around 1700 BCE, during the Old Babylonian period, earlier Sumerian traditions were reinterpreted and reorganized into more structured cosmological epics. The most famous of these is the Babylonian Enuma Elish, written in Akkadian and associated with the rise of Babylon under King Hammurabi's cultural influence. Unlike Sumerian fragments, Enuma Elish presents a more linear creation sequence, beginning with primordial waters and culminating in the establishment of Marduk as the chief deity after defeating Tiamat, a chaos entity representing the ocean. However, scholars consistently emphasize that Enuma Elish is not a direct continuation of Sumerian scripture. It is a later ideological reworking that reflects Babylon's political rise around the 18th century BCE. Where Sumerian traditions are decentralized and multivocal, Babylonian texts show increasing theological centralization, aligning cosmology with imperial authority. Speaking of imperial authority, the Sumerian king list, where myth and history intertwine. The Sumerian king list was not originally a single document, but was instead reconstructed from multiple cuneiform tablets discovered in Nippur, Lhasa, and Isin, dating broadly from around 2100 BCE to 1800 BCE. The most complete surviving version is the Weld-Blundell prism, now housed in the collections of the British Museum, where 4 vertical columns of tightly packed cuneiform compress millennia of rulers into a single ideological sequence. At first glance, the document reads like a straightforward record of dynasties, but the further back it goes, the more the narrative fractures into mythic time. Kings are not just long-lived, they are impossible. Early entries describe reigns lasting 28,800 years, 36,000 years, and even 43,200 years for individual rulers. 8 kings before the flood are said to have ruled for a combined total exceeding 240,000 years. Yes, before the flood. Much like the Christian and Islamic beliefs, the Sumerians also divided human history through this event, before the flood and after the flood. The flood functions as a boundary marker, separating mythic origins from semi-historical governance. This is not unique to Sumerian tradition. Flood narratives appear across Mesopotamian literature, including later Akkadian and Babylonian texts, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. But in the king list, the flood is more than just an event. It is a reset of political legitimacy. Before the flood, the kingship is described as having descended from heaven to the city of Eridu, one of the oldest known settlements in southern Mesopotamia, inhabited as early as 5,400 BCE. From there, it is said to move between cities like Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each city holds kingship for a time before it is transferred elsewhere. This idea reflects a political reality. Sumer was never a unified state, but a network of competing city-states, each claiming divine legitimacy. Archaeologically, what makes the king list particularly valuable is what comes after the mythic section. Post-flood dynasties begin to align more closely with material evidence. Rulers from cities such as Kish, Uruk, Ur, and Lagash appear in both the king list and independent inscriptions, administrative tablets, and monumental architecture. For example, the first dynasty of Uruk includes figures like Enmerkar and Gilgamesh, who appear in literary epics but may also be rooted in historical memory. Gilgamesh, traditionally placed around 2700 BCE, is supported by later Sumerian literary traditions and king list entries, though his exact historicity remains debated. By the early dynastic period, roughly between 2900 and 2350 BCE, the record becomes increasingly grounded. Kings such as Eannatum of Lagash, known from the Stele of the Vultures, and Enmetina appear in both archaeological inscriptions and administrative texts. These rulers governed city-states that controlled irrigation systems, temple economies, and military campaigns. Their reigns are measured in years, not millennia, and their achievements are recorded in practical terms. Land boundaries, taxation, warfare. The king list also reveals a central political ideology. Kingship is not permanent or inherited in a stable lineage, but transferable. The repeated phrase, "kingship was lowered from heaven," suggests that authority is granted by divine forces and can shift between cities depending on divine favor. This mirrors the unstable political reality of Mesopotamia, where dominance frequently shifted between urban centers over centuries. The transition from mythic to historical reigns is not abrupt but gradual. After the flood section, the text lists dynasties with increasingly realistic reign lengths. This shift corresponds with the rise of more structured political systems, particularly during the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad. around 2334 BCE, often considered one of the world's first imperial rulers. Sargon's empire unified much of Mesopotamia under centralized control, introducing a new model of kingship that differed from earlier city-state fragmentation. However, even in historically grounded sections, ideology remains embedded in the structure of the text. The king list is not neutral historiography. It is a legitimizing document, likely compiled or edited by scribes working in temple environments, particularly in cities like Nippur, which functioned as religious and administrative hubs. By presenting kingship as a continuous chain originating from divine descent, the text reinforces the idea that political authority is sanctioned by cosmic order, gods, journeys, and the logic of mythic geography. If you step into a Sumerian city around 2100 BCE, say Ur or Uruk, nothing about their worldview feels abstract or symbolic to them. When a farmer wakes before sunrise to work irrigation canals fed by the Euphrates, he is not just dealing with water management. That river is tied to divine order, controlled by gods like Enki, associated with freshwater and wisdom. If the water flows properly, crops grow. If it doesn't, if floods come too early or too late, that is not random weather. It is a disruption in cosmic balance. Without meteorology or hydrology, the explanation that makes the most sense is intention. Someone, somewhere in the divine hierarchy, has acted. The same logic governs politics. A king ruling in Ur or Nippur is not just a political leader. He is someone whose authority has been granted from above. Cities rise and fall. Rulers come and go, but the idea that power flows downward from a higher realm explains instability in a way that feels structured, not chaotic. Death, which is one of the most difficult experiences to explain even today, becomes something equally structured. Kur, the underworld, is not a vague unknown. It is a defined destination. When someone dies, they don't vanish into nothing. They go somewhere. That place has rules, boundaries, even rulers like Ereshkigal. For a society without biology, neuroscience, or modern medicine, this is not primitive thinking. It is a complete and internally consistent answer to what happens after death. And it shapes behavior. Burial practices in Mesopotamia often included offerings such as food, drink, and tools placed with the dead. That only makes sense if the afterlife is understood as a continuation of existence in another domain. You don't send goods with someone unless you believe they will need them. The belief in Kur directly influences how people treat the dead, how they mourn, and how they understand loss. Even danger in the physical world is filtered through this lens. Entering a dark, enclosed space like a cave or a deep well would naturally feel like crossing into another domain. Without geology or physics, the idea that the world has layers and that something exists beneath is intuitive. The same way the sky is above and clearly distinct, the ground suggests a below that is hidden but real. Kur fits that mental model perfectly. From the outside, it's easy to dismiss the idea of an underworld beneath the earth as naive. But that judgment depends on having access to modern geology, physics, and biology, fields that only emerged in the last few centuries. For someone living in 2000 BCE, the available data is entirely different. The sky above, the ground below, life, death, and cycles of nature that seem purposeful but unexplained. Given that evidence, a layered universe governed by intelligent forces is a perfectly logical conclusion. What makes it powerful is that it works. It explains why crops grow and fail, why rulers rise and fall, and why people live and die. It provides a framework for action, perform rituals, obey authority, respect the gods, and prepare for the afterlife. It reduces uncertainty in a world where unpredictability is constant and often dangerous. This is how the Sumerians lived. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.